So I'm ready to go into Liquify now. Command-Shift-X will take us right in. And let's start shaping this shoe. Remember, we're looking for an idealized shape, smooth lines that communicate high quality and speed and consistency. Now there's really not a lot I need to do to this shoe in the shaping stage. It's looking pretty clean. So let's exit out of there and start with our clipping. First thing I want to do, and you'll notice this is a difference between this shoe and the previous one we did, is my first step, I'm going to do a loose silo clip around the edge, because I want to do the tight silo clip in my working file. This is the main difference you're going to see between this process and the previous one. So now we've got a loose path around the shoe. I'm going to go ahead and set that as the outline. And just to show you how linked objects work, let's bring up our working file so we can see that shoe. We go back to what I just did and hit Command S to save that. See how quickly that updated with my new work. Label that shoe. Now I'm going to start doing all of my interior clipping for my tiered masking system. I'm going to use 2-pass clipping for the sole. Notice that the rubber band is turned off. You might find this, and I really like to use it because it shows me that trailing edge from the last point I laid down. I find that to be really useful. Now remember, in 2-pass clipping, we go around the shape twice, adding new points, and especially with a shape like this that's long and fluid, I'm going to add as few points as possible in order to make this nice line. And notice where I'm placing the line in relationship to the sole. I'm not trying to exactly mimic the line that's there. I'm trying to create the line that I want to be there. Now, it's pretty clear to me that I want the sole and the mid element clipped out. Next, I really have a bit of a hard time choosing what else to clip out. And the test that I want to use in my mind when looking at this is, do I see any other edges that could really benefit from being extracted and cleaned with Liquify? And I think this edge definitely could benefit from that. It would be easier than maybe cleaning it up later using pixel-based tools, and maybe this edge a bit too. So I'm just going to clip out this sort of laminated material that's on top of the fabric of the shoe. I'm going to call that laminate. Okay, that's all I want to clip out on this shoe, so I'm ready to start setting up my masks. And remember, as part of our tiered mask system, we need to have pixels at the base of all of these folders. Let's duplicate our base raw smart object into each one. And the bottom one, I'm going to put into a folder called base. Now we're ready to set up our guides for edge cleaning. Set a selection for the sole. Bring up 2 pixel layers. I like using different colors for the different guides that I set up. We need to do one for the interior of the sole and the exterior. I'm going to call that sole with minuses next to it. The one that has the positive shape has sole pluses next to it. Let's move on to the mid. Change the color a bit. One for the positive shape, one for the negative shape. And for the laminate, shift the color a little bit more. Command-Shift-I to invert your selection. I'm just going to name those lamb. Great, so now I've got all of my edge guides set up and I can move into Liquify to easily load those as overlays and trim out my edges. Let's go into the first smart object in the sole, double click on Liquify, and load up the negative shape of the sole at 100% opacity. Start. If you ever get this error dialog, which you probably will, it comes up if you don't use Liquify a lot, click Don't Show Again and OK and forget about it. So what I'm looking for here are any edges that extend down below the guide. Work on a relatively small image, so you see some pixelation of the mask because I'm zoomed in to 400%. But I'm just going to go quickly along the edge and just sweep this stuff under the rug. Sole's done. Now since we're focusing on the sole, let's move on to the mid. Double click on that Liquify and use the positive shape of the sole first and trim the mid down so that it meets that sole edge in a really clean way. Now, since this image is smaller, you're going to see a little bit of distortion of the pixels. That's natural. Just be sure not to push that too far so that you see obvious warping in any of the detail. Now remember, at this point I'm just working on this mid object here, so I don't want to move on and start working on any of the areas of the laminate or any of the areas of the base, and that's easy to forget. So just focus on the object that you're trying to trim out and create good edges for. Now we can use the mid negative shape to make any adjustments to the top areas of the mid. And there's not a whole lot that I'm going to do here. Just streamline that edge just a bit. Click OK and move on. Now let's work on the laminate. Double click on that Liquify. Load the laminate negative shape. See if there's any improvements we can make along this line. I don't see any edges along the top really. Might trim that out. I'm going to load the sole guide, and I can definitely make some improvements along this line. Now, we've got plenty of work to do on the base. Let's move on to that. Double click on the base Liquify. And why don't we start with the laminate positive shape. if there's anything along the edge we can improve. This edge looks pretty clean up here, but along the back it looks like there's some glue. Let's just tuck that under. Now there's definitely some grody stuff along the top of the mid, so let's switch to that positive shape. Just start tucking under. Now last, let's go to the sole positive shape. And tuck in only in the places where it meets the base. And click OK, and we're good to go. Now just to see the difference, I'm going to duplicate up my base smart object, throw away any liquefies that I made, rasterize that, because at the top of my work, I always like to keep an original version just so that I can go back and forth and see the progress that I made. Let's duplicate the mask so they both have the same mask. It's just easier to see the before and after. Now, that's pretty good progress in just a few minutes. It's important to remember the old style of doing edge cleanup, and we used to use the stamp tool and healing brush, and we're trying to create clean, smooth edges between shapes, and that can be super long and tedious work. With this new method of tiered masks and pixel layers at the bottom of each group using liquefying guides, we can achieve that edge cleanup in a fraction of the time that it used to take using the traditional pixel tools. And this also preserves a completely deconstructed image in the way that we never have to do any global adjustments on pixel layers where everything is contained within a group and all of our edges are preserved as separate elements, aka masks. And we can adjust those separately to create nice edges. All right, couple of house cleaning things we need to do before moving on to the actual pixel cleanup work. I can see along the sole edge that that's a little sharp there. So I like just adding a little dynamic feather to that. And look how that sits right in there once we add a little bit of feather on. I'm going to add the same to each element that I isolated, because I wanted to create those sharp edges, but I just need the softness of the edges to match the sort of focal situation of the entire shoe. That's better. So one thing that you might have noticed is that I duplicated the same smart object up into each layer group. Now that's intentional. It may seem redundant, but the reason that we do that is we still want to have access to that raw information in case we need to change something at this stage, which I'm going to show you how to do. And we want that to be applied to every part of the image that we've clipped out and put into a group. Since that's the same smart object, I can have different liquefies on each one, but at the base of it, it still contains our raw information. I noticed here that I'm getting some chromatic aberration in the image, and I missed that initially. But you know what? I can change it now by turning on Remove Chromatic Aberration you'll notice all that weird color that shows up on the edges immediately disappears. Let's click OK. Now, that's just not applied to the base. That's also updated in every smart object in each layer group, because they're all the same smart object. To demonstrate that a little bit better, I'm going to go into the raw file and just show you. If I change the exposure on the shoe, click OK. That applies to every single part of my image that I've broken out because it's the same smart object. Now, I don't want the shoe to look like that. That was just for demonstration purposes. But remember in the old days when we didn't have embedded smart objects or linked smart objects. In this case, these are all embedded. That means they all live in this working file. If we wanted to do something like that after we'd broken out pixels into each group, we need to go inside and actually make those changes manually to each of those pixel layers, basically multiplying the work we had to do by 4 in this case. And smart objects really allow us to make a single change and have it cascade across the entire system. So we've been looking at an image that I balanced earlier on with just some basic settings in here to make it look good visually for the composite, but let's just go back to the original and I can show you why I made those adjustments in the first place. The same way that I did in the working file with the athlete. I'm going to make sure that I have information in the shadows, and you can see here in the base file, these are pretty dark, and I don't want to start retouching on top of that with it all plugged up. So you can really open up these areas a lot, as long as you don't start introducing errors into the file like added grain or weird aberrations. And the highlights look pretty good at this stage. They have some information in them that I know I can brighten those later. So this looks pretty well balanced. Let's hit OK. And watch that update in our working file. And then just so we can see the update in the athlete working file, I'm going to hit save again. Maybe we can brighten that up a little bit more even. We can always go back into the raw file. I'm very careful about opening up the exposure in a shot. In this case, I think we can add a little bit. Click OK. Update the shoe file, hit save to update the athlete file. That's a good starting point for me to do the retouching. I've got the first shoe in there. It's loosely clipped out. I've got a lot of the initial shaping and edge cleanup done. I want to go on to the next shoe and do that same thing just so I can get a nicely finished, a little bit closer to finished shoe for that back one so I can see again what everything looks like in the athlete comp. So I'm going to start working on the back shoe now. Just go through the same exact process I did on the front. So the liquefy looked pretty good on this shoe. I didn't need to do a whole lot. Now I'm making my rough silo, or silo, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's the industry standard spelling for the outside silhouette path of any object. Now we're ready to move into the interior shapes, which once again I'm going to use 2-pass clipping for because it's fast and easy. Remember, once again, I'm trying to create the line I want, not necessarily the line that's there. So people constantly ask me how to clip, where to put the line, where do I need to put it along the edge? Now the answer is it depends, but there are a few guiding rules. In terms of outlining an image that you know that's going to be composited into something or the background's going to be swapped out, clip just a little bit inside the shape because you know the outside of the shape is going to be trimmed off anyway. No one's going to know that you trimmed off a millimeter or a molecule off the edge, especially if it improves the shape. Now, in terms of the interior shapes, like I say, you want to create the line you want. A lot of retouchers make the error of trying to exactly trace all of the things that are already in the image. Now, this is where you ask yourself, what's your job? You want to create the idealized image, not the image that's there. So if you're constantly following this system and you understand how we set up masks, layer groups, and edges, now you have the tools to think about an image in terms of its component parts and the idealized edges between things. Because you can see, once we put all that together, those tiny changes, those tiny improvements are incremental steps in creating a whole big improvement in quality overall. Now, looking on this and trying to make the choice of what I want to clip next, I think there's really only one more path I want to make, and it's this area here where the fabric meets that laminate material on top. Great, now we're ready to set up our folders. Now, once again, I remembered on the other shoe that I did, I wanted to fix the chromatic aberration. And I don't need to undo setting up these base pixel layers because once again, they're the same base smart object. And I can go in and I can make any adjustments I need to make. Now, I did some tweaks on the contrast and lights and darks of that last shoe. And I want this shoe to pretty much match that. So I'll show you how I can go in and remove the chromatic aberration, but also match the previous conversion. It's really easy. Double click on the smart object because we know any change we make here is going to affect all of them. Let's remove the chromatic aberration. And we don't need to go back and look at these settings that we made in the previous conversion. We can simply use the drop down, set it to previous conversion. And it carries over those little tweaks that I made to this shoe so that we have two exactly matching shoes. Click OK. And those changes are applied to every smart object in our system. This is what's so important, and I can't stress it enough, which is why I'm coming back to it. Most people don't understand why we have so many smart objects at the base of all the components of our files. It looks excessive. But now that you can see, when I need to make changes, how incredibly powerful and flexible that is. Now we're ready to set up our edge clean guides. Remember, Command and Option Delete fill pixel layers with either the foreground or background color. Get used to those shortcut keys to dramatically improve your speed. Just to be clear why I choose to put pluses and minuses next to these layer names, is because once we get into Liquify, if you have a lot of layers built up in your file already, having indicators like these long strings of pluses and minuses makes it really easy to see which layers you want to use as guides when you load them as your overlay. And the reason that I use the plus or minus is so that I know that one is the positive shape and one is the negative shape. Command-Shift-I inverts your selection. Notice I can set these selections either from the masks that I've already created or my paths. Okay, with all of our guides set up, let's go in and quickly knock out these edge cleanup changes that we want to make. And you can start anywhere, really. It's just down to personal preference. I like to go in a fairly linear fashion on most of these things so I don't forget anything. But as long as you know what you're liquefying and what guides to use, you can use your choice, your taste here. I'm going to load the negative shape of the laminate. You can already see we can make an improvement right there. Now, what is important is making sure you've got your layer groups set up in a way that is consistent with how you clip them out. In this case, on both these shoes, the sole is the shape that I started with, so I visualize that shape as being the one that's closest to me, therefore it needs to be the top of the stack. Everything else cascades down underneath it. Let's go into the mid. Just trying to straighten that edge out a bit. Let's load sole, positive shape. We can definitely clean up that edge. Move on to the sole. See how easy it is to see the layers in here that I'm using as guides. If I just had those named with regular undercase, it'd be really hard to track down each time. I'm a big fan of reducing the sort of cognitive stress that I have to deal with when I'm using this workflow, which is why I've developed all these different plans to just save me, a little bit of brain power here and there. If you can do that and think in terms of small efficiencies, continue to integrate those into your workflow, that all adds up to a whole lot of more pleasure in the retouching process. And at the end of the day, you're going to move a lot faster and you're going to feel a lot better. So let's go now into the base and finish up this work. Start with the sole positive shape. Sweep. Like I said before, this sort of feels like cheating. And I always use that metaphor of you're sort of sweeping things under the rug. But as long as you really pay close attention to not altering the shape, the features of the shoe too much, or in a way that really degrades any of the textures or any of the details of the shoe, you can get away with a lot at this stage, and it moves really, really fast. Once again, let's create our original, clear the smart filters, rasterize the layer, duplicate the mask. Let's make sure we name it original so we don't think it's a work layer. That is just for comparison. And go back and forth to see all the improvements we made in a pretty quick process. So I'm going to clean up some of the mask edges. I think we used not 876, but 0.7 in our last shoe. Let's make sure we match that. All right, we're good to go. Let's save this shoe out. Watch it update in our file. See now that we're making pretty big steps forward in getting these guys integrated. Now, it's important to note that we're going to do the sort of localized cleanup within our smart objects. This is another step where we're keeping a lot of our work in the smart object in order to conserve file size, because that's just encapsulated in that smart object and it doesn't have to exist in our working file. So let's start back in on the front shoe. Bring that up front and center. And I'm going to start with my frequency separations. So now I'm ready to run frequency separation on that base smart object. Let's do it. Now, this is important to always review. When using frequency separation, it's always going to be the big question, how much median do I run? And I can say 90% of the time you want to run just enough median in order to wipe away just enough off the high layer. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. 6 is pretty much way too high for this size of image. Remember, that shoe is pretty small in the frame of the shot, so it's not very big. 6 really blurs this out and wipes way too much high frequency information off of the low. I'm going to reduce that down to maybe 4, maybe 3. And you can really sort of get a sense for this by turning on and off the preview and seeing just how much comes off the high. I really think 3 is probably going to be good for this image. I'm okay with still seeing a little bit of textural detail in here. I know that if I've moved this much detail to the high frequency layer, that's going to sit on top, so I have a little bit of leeway in terms of the wiping that I can do underneath that, and I can destroy a little bit of that fabric texture. Click OK. Got my layers. Let's start in on the low. You can already see there's some irregularities in the toe here and here on the side where we can definitely smooth that out pretty fast. Let's go to the mixer brush tool. Make sure we've got our values in the right position. I'm going to reduce the wet to like 60% here. And let's just start cleaning on the low. Now, remember, what I'm looking for here are just any irregularities that don't look sort of streamlined or formalized. Now, it might not look like much, but when I do my before and after, you can see I really smoothed out the form of that whole base panel. And when you turn the high back on, you might get a little bit different picture about what it looks like, because once you see those two integrated, you're going to make additional decisions on the low. And don't think that you have to have the high turned off in order to work on the low. And you'll see that the separation did a good job of retaining all the high frequency information, and I'm still able to pretty easily move information around on the low layer without being too careful. That's the big benefit of frequency separation, is taking tasks that we used to have to be really, really careful about and tedious about and granular about, and breaking those down in a way that makes it just easier for us to do and faster, but also more enjoyable. Like I say, frequency separation using mixer brush always seems like you're almost cheating, and it can be pretty fun to just clean stuff up, where in the past it was a pretty painful operation. So another thing I see right now that I want to clean up are these eyelets over here, and I can see there's a lot of junk here on the low. I can go in there, really start to sculpt those up a little bit. All right, let's keep working on that. We can turn the high on at any point to see what that looks like. You can switch on to the high and use the stamp tool. Make sure it's set to current layer, remember. Start cleaning up any garbage around edges or features. Back to the low if we need to change anything there. Just want to continue this line down here so it's a little bit more consistent. See that before and after. Yeah, that's pretty good quick results. Let's move on to the next element. Actually, I have a little bit more base. Yeah, I need to do over here. Let me take a look at that area. Not so much on the low, but definitely on the high. It looks like there's some glue that we can clean up along the edge. Now, I think it's worth stopping here and looking at how easy and powerful this method is for cleanup. Now, you might have looked at this shoe initially because it was a pretty good looking shoe and said to yourself, this looks great, really, what do I fix? I mean, you might be able to see some things, but overall, when you start with a shoe that's pretty nice already, it may be hard to make those decisions about what you're going to clean up. And this is exactly what I said last segment on Adam's shoe. As long as you just follow this system, break it down into these component parts, separate it, and go through each of those steps one by one, you can always find at least a 5%, 10% improvement that you can make somewhere in each of those individual parts, rather than looking at the whole and trying to make a whole lot of decisions at once. The power of this system and these methods is breaking it down into individual parts where you don't have to think so much and you just move through in a very linear fashion. And you'll see with these methods that we've developed to make our lives easier, like frequency separation 2.0, we don't have to pay attention so carefully to like where I'm sampling from. I mean, you know, if you've used clone stamp tool on fabric patterns, you have to pay super close attention to where you're sampling from and where you're placing that information. But right now, since I've separated these two components into the high and the low, on the high, especially in this area here, I'm basically just cloning grain. And if I unclip this high, I can see what that information actually is on this layer. Now it's a little bit difficult to see here, but if we pull way in, it's basically just grain. So that eliminates the need for me to be really super careful about where I clone and where I put that information back down. All right, cool. That's some really good fast cleanup on the base layer. Maybe a couple more little specks that we can clean off. And it's just fantastic to be able to move this quickly through cleanup. And before and after, pretty cool. Good results for such little effort. I want to make one more change to the low here. Let me go back to the mixer brush. Just want to drag that darker area down so I have a nice smooth gradation here on the side of the shoe. It gives it a nice shape, nice form, having that slight highlight there. All right, that looks good to me. I'm going to move on to the next steps. I'm going to go up to the laminate. Once again, running my frequency separation action. I know I've got that value down. I like 3. I like the way it worked. Just going to use it again, not think about it too much. And on the low, I'm just going to keep the high on this time. Smooths out the gradation there on the toe. Some stuff in here that just magically goes away. really cool trick with the mixer brush is to use a brush that is not pressure sensitive. Switch to that. Click somewhere where you want to create a smooth line. Click once from the start, shift, and click again. And you can extend that line. I'll keep returning to that shift click method throughout the entire course so that you can see how it works in multiple situations. I'm going to switch over to the high with the stamp tool. There's a little bit of stuff on the edge that might come off. Now I'm looking at a little bit of detail down here. I don't know if that's actually in this group or the group below. So I'm going to turn off the base. Let's just see there. Looks like that's on my base layer. And the nice thing about having it set up in this way is we can always return and do any more work that we need to do on lower layers. All right, I'm going to call that good on the laminate part. Let's turn that on and off. Good improvements. And I'm going to move right up to the mid. Run the same separation on 3. Turn off my high because I want to see the low. This is a good place to really see the power of mixer brush. I can just wipe that stuff away. I don't have to worry about anything that's underneath it or adjacent to it. And remember, I'm still on that non-pressure sensitive brush, so I can do a little bit of shift clicking. Click, hold down shift, click again, and it smooths and extends that line. It's a really easy way to smooth lines. There's a little bit of garbage going on up here. I think that's also back on the base. So I'm going to switch back and real quickly see if I can clone that out. That goes away pretty easily. Pretty good work on the low. Let's clean up the high just a little bit. Sometimes getting the lines right on the high Can be a little bit tricky. I just wanted to get rid of a little bit of edge detail there. Was seeing a little bit of edge there, so I just tucked that under. Maybe fix a little bit of this texture in here, like a little bit of irregularity. It's now looking pretty uniform. And if this overlay is distracting to you, because in some cases using an overlay in your clone stamp is really useful, but when you're working on the high, it can be a little distracting because it's all it's going to show you is that little gray spot there. You can go into your clone settings, turn off or on show overlay. Now we don't see that anymore. So the mid's looking pretty good. Let's move on to the sole. We're almost done. I'll run that same separation on 3. Let's work on the low. Seeing a little variation in the line here, so once again I'm just going to do the shift click move, smooths that right out. Here too. And these all look like features on the heel, so I'm going to leave those. And I'm going to clean that up. Now notice that I'm pushing way outside the shape of the shoe here, but since I haven't done my true silo clip on the shoe yet, you're still seeing all that come out. Now I know that, I don't have to worry about that because when I go back into the working file, I'm going to clip that part out and all that stuff is going to be completely enclosed in that silo mask that I know that I'm going to make in a few steps. Let's turn on the high. Make quick work of any weird details that are in there. Now, it might be hard to see some of the detail in here because it's so bright. A cool trick you can do is to use what I call a visualizer curve. Some people call them solar curves, but we use them to visualize stuff and to see stuff in the image. It's a curve that we're not using to make an adjustment. It's a curve that we're using to reveal errors in the file that we can't really see that well with our eye. So with this curve, all I'm going to do is just increase the contrast here. In any way that shows me a little bit more of what's going on in these bright areas. And I can see already that there's some tonal shifts that I didn't notice at first. I'm going to go back to the mixer brush and just smooth those out. Super easy. Cool, so that's a pretty clean sole. Now, you might not think that you have to pay attention to stuff that you can't see, but you do. That's the level of craft that we go into here on a true high-level commercial product, is we know to look for stuff that even we can't see using tools that we've come up with in order to do that. That's the level of finish that high-end clients expect too. So you may not think that's important for this shoe or for round one or even for this entire project. Your client might not even be able to see it, but that's going to go someplace. It might end up in the hands of another retoucher or even you. You might have to change the color of this sole down the line. So if you're able to put in this level of finish right now, mistakes like that aren't going to come back and bite you in the ass when you have to change the color and it has to go dark. And then all of a sudden, all those errors come out and you have more work to do. So put in the time on the front end with that careful eye and get the highest quality finish that you can right off the bat. So I'm done with the cleanup on this shoe right now. Let's look at the before and after the whole thing just to bask in the glory of what we've accomplished in very little time. Now, this is the point to also reflect on if in the beginning you didn't really think there was a whole lot to do to the shoe, following that system, once again, created this completely finished product just by keeping your head down and looking at individual areas of the image and following the steps. So I'm going to go ahead and update the working file again by hitting save. All right, cool. We've got the first shoe completely polished, and I'm going to attack the second shoe. I'm just going to cruise through at my normal working speed so you can see what that looks like. I'm going to do it pretty much exactly the same way. Check it out. All right, cool. I'm done with this shoe. Let's check out before and after. So we've got the shoes to a pretty pristine, basic state now, and I'm ready to move on with the next steps for integration, the next steps for isolating the apparel on the athlete for those color changes that we need to make. That's where you're going to see Frequency Separation 2.0 really shine. It was nice on the shoes, but once we start getting into folds and fabric, it's going to totally blow your mind.